Okay, here we go again. We're on to our next class, and here we are kind of stopping this little bit by bit general information that I've been giving you so far. And I'm going to be moving back down to where I can get some stuff here that I want to focus on. And what I want to focus on here at this particular time is intercultural communications. Now, if there's one area where I sort of consider myself an expert, if you'd call it that, it would be intercultural communications. But then also, if there's one area where I realize how little I know and the vast amount of information that's out there and how much there is still to be learned, it would be intercultural communication. Because you see, the more you study some topic, the more you realize that the amount of material information out there is incredibly huge. And at the same time, there's probably a lot of information and material that has yet to be discovered or printed or written up or whatever. And so for all of those reasons, we're getting into an area now that's very complex and fascinating and well worth time and study. As I mentioned before, I've advocated that we start a class just in intercultural communication, a different one, where I could focus on this for the entire semester. But so far we haven't been able to do that, so for that reason I include the intercultural communication segment as a couple of 3 lectures actually within this particular class, World Evangelism, because that's kind of where it fits. Now, I do touch on this a little bit in the World Cultures class as well, not so much in the World Religion class, but in the World Cultures class I do a little bit. But that's not really the area for it either. In the World Cultures class, we're talking about a specific culture and what it's like and some of its characteristics and all of that. Not so much that back and forth between 2 cultures. We live in a world that's very much integrated today. There was a time when a country or a section of the world or whatever was so isolated, there was almost no interaction with other parts of the world. We would look back to Europe before the discovery of the Americas. There were people living over here. They had their own culture. There were empires. There were these individual, what you call nations, the Indian nations or whatever, and they vied with one another for control of areas, for resources, all that kind of thing. They had their own world. The Europeans had another one. And as the Europeans came over, and it's like, wow, where'd all these people come from? They're weird, they're different, they're strange. The interaction was one of conquest. They're not like us, so they must not be people really. And so they thought it was okay to just kill them off and steal everything that they had. And they did. So for all of those reasons, then, intercultural communication is significant. At a time when it did not exist, it only produced warfare and destruction and conquest and genocide. A properly maintained intercultural communication, we can enjoy and benefit from and receive the wealth of another culture. And we can share with them then some of the things that in our culture have been very beneficial and very worthwhile. And that's what's been happening in the world, recently, certainly. In a very accelerated manner after World War II, but from the age of discovery on to a certain degree. Now, as intercultural communication developed as a discipline, we started to realize some very interesting facts. One is that people think very differently. At one time, language was called a tongue, the English tongue, the Spanish tongue, all of that. In fact, our word language is actually the Latin word tongue, lingua. And so we thought people had a different tongue, and so that's why they spoke differently. Well, it didn't take long for anatomists to start looking at the human body and say, well, I don't see any difference. Their tongue looks just like our tongue. So it wasn't the tongue that made people talk differently. It came from the mind. And not only did it come from the mind as like an origin, it came from the mind as a logical, structural, functional organ. That's important because there's a tendency to think everybody thinks like I do. In reality, nobody thinks like I do. Now that's not because I'm crazy. Well, it might be a little bit of that, but that's probably not the primary reason. It's just that we are different. We grew up in different worlds. We grew up in different times. We grew up in different families. Every family has its own little culture. It has its own little way of functioning. It's never exactly like the family next door. And so, for that reason, the child that grows up here is always going to think a little bit differently from the child that grew up right next door. And the further away we get geographically, culturally, time wise, the greater the difference will be. I grew up, for example, before computers existed. Yet you talk to a child today, a 10-year-old or something, they can't imagine that. Well, when I grew up, they talked about time before electricity, before cars, and I couldn't imagine that. How in the world did you have a world that didn't have electricity, that didn't have cars, and things of that nature? So, as technology advances, as culture advances, as people advance and move on, it kind of leaves some things in the dust, but it also means that there is an increasing divergence in the way we look at the world and the way that we think and the way that we understand. Now, to illustrate that, when I'm in class, I do something that I really like to do because it's fascinating, it's hilarious. And that is, I simply start out by asking, I always start with the ladies first. I always ask the girls in the class, the ladies in the class, anyone here married? Well, there's always at least a couple, two or three in there that are married, it seems like. So, yeah, I'm married here, okay. All right, let's see that. Does your husband think exactly like you do? You know what the response is? Always. They laugh. They start laughing. They go, no, he doesn't think like I do. Obviously not. Well, there you got a man, you got a woman. They've been living together for, I don't know, a few years, whatever. I was married for 46 years, as I said. I never got to the point where I thought like my wife did. There's a lot of times she thought I was crazy. A lot of times I thought, that doesn't make sense to me, but that's her. We think differently. Now, if I were to take something called an electroencephalograph, a little machine that I can use to see brain waves, I hook them up to this young lady sitting over here. Then I hook another one up to this young fella sitting over here. And I put a simple question up on the board, something incredibly basic. 1 + 1 is 2. Now, that's such a simple thing. Everybody ought to deduce in the same way how to come to the answer, and especially if they come to the same answer. It should be the same, right? No, it's not. This young lady over here will do it in one way, and she'll use a different part of her brain in a different way to come to that conclusion. This guy over here, he will think about it. He'll say, well, that's simple. That's 1 + 1, that's 2. But yet, when I read the brain waves, he's thought in a different way, he's used a different part of his brain, and he's come up with the same conclusion. Now, that's true when we're dealing with something as simple as basic math. If we start getting into something that's much more complicated, what's right and what's wrong? Wow. You ever watch these, say, the Muslim radicals on TV, if they interview one of them and everything, and they're railing against America, and they're killing everybody, and, all that, and that's good. And you say, how in the world can anyone think like that? I mean, how can it be good to go out and kill people, just murder them? Well, to them it is. It makes sense to them. It's logical to them. It's not to us. Now, we can explain our way of thinking, and it's just simple and straightforward and all that, and obviously we're right. And they'll look at us and go, that's crazy. How can you possibly think that? How can you come to a conclusion like that? That's wrong. And so we've come to realize that language actually represents thought patterns. And people think differently, and the language reflects that. Now, let me give you a very concrete example. In Spanish, or in English, I'll pick up this coffee cup. I just finished a cup of great Colombian coffee after lunch. Gave me the energy to keep going. I hope so, anyhow. Recommend you try good Colombian coffee. It'll spoil you for the nasty stuff you normally drink up here, but anyhow, that's another point. Pick up this cup. In English, I'd say a red cup, right? Makes perfect sense. I mean, the article, red, a modifier, cup, the noun. Okay, that's good. That's how you diagram a simple sentence. But in Spanish, I'd say el pocillo rojo. Well, I put the article first like we did in English, but then I said the cup, and then after the cup, I put the modifier. Well, they would say that makes sense in Spanish, because, I mean, after all, what's the point of talking about red when you don't know what you're talking about? I mean, you only talk about the modifier once you've identified the object. That's simple, isn't it? To them it is. To us, no, it's not. And so something as simple as a simple sentence. Something as simple as a simple descriptive sentence. And you do it two very different ways in different cultures. Take this cup again, and I say, okay, whoom, slipped out of my hands and I dropped it. In English, I would say, oh, I broke my coffee cup. Got to go get another one. In Spanish, you wouldn't. I'd say, I dropped my coffee cup in English. In Spanish, they would say, se cayó. It fell. It fell and broke. Well, that doesn't make sense to me. It did not just fall and break. You dropped it. And the Spanish-speaking person would say, no, I didn't. It fell. Because to them, if you say, I dropped it, that implies intentionality. I did it because I wanted to do it. If it is an accident, then you don't want to do it. It just happened. So it fell. So you can start to see the foundational logic is very different. Now that's from Spanish to English, and Spanish and English are both European languages. Spanish and English, both for some degree at least, are what we would call a Romance language. They have roots in the old Latin of the Roman Empire. Now English, not totally, it's not considered a full-fledged Romance language, but Rome did control England for several hundred years, and a lot of our root words are Spanish or Latin, or from the same roots as the Spanish words in the Latin language. And so it does have that commonality. And yet in spite of that commonality, there's that much divergence. Now, if that's the case between two European languages and two languages that have at least some roots in Roman Latin, what would happen if we go to a language that's had no contact with Aristotelian logic, with Greek linear thought, with the common origin of the Latin, the Roman common language? Say if we go to Japan or China or Thailand or something like that, ancient languages and cultures that predate even the Greek and certainly the English culture, logical systems that were developed in a very different world at a very different time, and logical systems that to them make perfect sense, and to us they make no sense or very little sense. Had a friend of mine who was doing some teaching in Africa, and done his teaching, and he said, okay, I'm going to give you a test. Not only cheating on this test, here's a test, and he gives it to him. He hands out the test, and right away they start looking at each other's papers and helping one another. Wait a minute, I told you no cheating here. Yeah, everybody's got to do their own work. And so, okay, fine, all right, go to it again. Right back to helping one another out and looking at one another's papers. Oh, wait, you got to stop this here. You're cheating. He says, cheating? We're not cheating. Oh, yeah, you are. You're looking at one another's papers. He says, well, what's cheating about that? I mean, you help one another out, don't you? Isn't that life? Isn't that what you're supposed to do? Well, you see, in their culture, it wasn't an independent, individualistic culture like American culture. It was communal. And so you lived in a communal fashion. You helped one another out. You did for them what you couldn't do for yourself. They did for you what you could not do for yourself. And that's the way you lived. And so it wasn't cheating to share. It was what's expected of you. And so the American professor thought cheating was showing your work to the other guy. They thought cheating was hiding your work from the other guy. And so the exact opposite meaning was applied to the very same term. And it made perfect sense to each one in their culture. Now, I hope you're beginning to see that this whole concept of intercultural communication is incredibly complicated. How's it going to work then if I start trying to teach in Latin America and I'm very insistent on saying, you broke that? I'm accusing them of something. It's going to be very hurtful for our relationship. It's going to be very damaging to my ability to transmit information to them because I'm accusing them of doing something wrong. I'm accusing them of intentionally breaking something, and they did not intentionally break the cup. And so I think in one way, or I did anyhow, because I was an American, I was taught to do that from childhood. And this goes on and on. Lying, for example. What's lying? Well, lying is if it doesn't exactly line up with the truth or what happened. But you know what? If I ask you to describe some event out on campus, and you three people right here all saw this event, maybe a wreck. Somebody came in Academic Avenue and somebody came their way and didn't see, boom, crunch. Okay, describe that. You know what? All three of you would have a very different description of what happened, of who was at fault, about how serious it was, all that. Who's telling the truth? Well, you all are, you think. I'm describing it the way I saw it. So our idea of the truth being what exactly lines up with what happened is fictitious. It does not exist. It's in our mind. And we get into other cultures, then that just becomes even more and more of a difference and of a problem. And so, as you can see, every person develops this concept of reality. What's reality for me? What's right and what's wrong? And if it varies between a husband and wife, as it obviously does, and we can see so readily, it's going to vary if we go someone from the north to somebody from the deep south, somebody from the west coast to somebody from the Midwest. And if it's that way within our own culture, jump to another culture, like South America. Both European based, both coming from relatively small regions of the world and original tribal groups that were related in some way. And yet that much difference. Then if we jump to a totally different area of the world, it's like radical. So how in the world can we communicate like that? Well, it's very difficult and it's very tricky. And that's the reason we really need a class in this whole area. Any of you guys have influence with the higher ups up there, maybe you can put a bug in there. We'll try to touch it at least enough in this area that you go out of this class aware of the issue and aware of the difficulties that you face. And as I've been talking about research and learning and adapting, in a manner in which, by being aware of the problem and by knowing how to go about it, you should be able to do a little bit of study and research on your own. If you do not do it in your educational career, then on your own, on the field or wherever you are, so that you can begin to ask yourself, what's going on here? Why is it these people are not understanding what I'm saying? They understand the words, but they don't understand the meaning. Translation, for example. You come down to Columbia, I put you talking. I don't do a word-for-word translation. I could, but it'd come out pretty funny. You ever uses Google Translation? It's getting a lot better now. But boy, in the beginning, it was really strange because it was word for word. Well, you can't do that. Now with this artificial intelligence, yeah, they're doing better. But even then, it still comes up with some pretty funny stuff if you try to translate something from Thailand or something like that into English. So intercultural communication is of utmost importance. In fact, I would say you're not educated unless you learn the basic skills of adapting your thought process and your logic, your message, to the hearer and what they are thinking when they listen to you. Okay, I'll deal with this a little bit more in the next lecture as we start dealing with the nitty-gritty of it, the actual application and usage, but I'm hoping that that gives you at least an introduction to what we're talking about and how significant and how complex this issue is.